You know, innovation requires a certain kind of vision. We've seen that today. It requires the ability to see old problems in a new light. It requires the ability to imagine new ways of using technology as devices get smaller and faster and more powerful. Today, we are fortunate to have Jonathan Taplin as our speaker because he has proven himself over a long career to be a person with that kind of vision. He served, now maybe not when this first opera, the first thing is he served as tour manager for Bob Dylan and the band in 1969. Were any of you there? Now, nobody wants to admit that old, I know. And then he produced Martin Scorsese's first feature film and worked on numerous other television and feature film productions that have been nominated for Golden Globe and Oscar awards. But the reason he's here today, I would say, is that he also holds the patents for 2 video-on-demand technologies and helped pioneer new content delivery systems for both cable and broadband internet markets. So please join me in welcoming the director of the Annenberg Innovation Lab at the University of Southern California, Mr. Jonathan Taplin.
Well, it's a thrill to be back here in Chattanooga. Can we bring up the slides? I've spent a lot of time here with my friends at EPB, and you know, one of the things that you realize is it used to be, I used to say, well, if you want to see where the future is in terms of telecommunications, go to Seoul, South Korea, because that's where they have, you know, 300 megabits per second internet. And now I can tell my students and my partners at the Innovation Lab, which are companies like IBM and Warner Brothers and Sony and Cisco, well, if you want to see the future, go to Chattanooga, because that's... And you know, I've been blown away by what EPB is doing, but just today to see what the people at American Bicycle and Global Green Lighting, and by the way, I think this nudge thing is going to really catch on. We've been thinking about how transmedia and medical applications are going to make, you know, transmedia wellness. Well, they seem to have gotten ahead of us, so that's pretty cool too. So I want to talk to you a little bit about, you know, we've just been through an election, and there's still a lot of kind of anger and stuff in this country, and you know, I travel around the world. My wife and her are about to go to France, where I'm going to give the keynote address at the Monaco Media Forum. And some people say, well, America's in decline, and other people say to me, oh, China is going to beat our butt, you know, everywhere, and I just don't believe it. And so I want to talk a little bit about the roots of what makes America so special in terms of the way the founders designed this country to allow innovation to happen, and then maybe spend the last part of this talking about Chattanooga and Tennessee in general and how you could really get ahead of everybody in terms of the way you think about innovation. So this talk is called America 3.0 because I believe really we need a kind of new operating system. And so that means that I have to go back and tell you what America 1.0 was, which was a really good idea. It was based on 3 basic principles, one of which was Jefferson's idea that we all ought to be able to pursue life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. So this notion of liberty. The second was George Washington's idea in his farewell address, which is it will be our policy to cultivate tranquility home and abroad and extend our commerce as far as possible. In other words, that we would be a peaceful nation, we would never be an imperialist power, and we would want to trade with everybody. And the third and most important part of this was a very unique idea, which was the notion of federalism. Jefferson said it was the true theory of our Constitution that states are independent as to everything within themselves and united as to everything respecting foreign nations. And this notion of federalism allowed us to grow and have regional power and regional interest and regional differentiation. I believe that somewhere along the way, and I'll show you where, we kind of began to abandon those two ideas of federalism and anti-imperialism. And the federal government needed much more money to fund a large military establishment, and it needed to tax more and more, and that meant that the states had less, and the federal government got more and more complicated and bureaucratic, and the states had less freedom to do what they needed to do to innovate. Now, if we were a company, if America were a company, we'd have to say, well, this is getting kind of sclerotic and bureaucratic, and what do we do about this? And I was lucky enough to have IBM as one of the initial sponsors at the Innovation Lab, and one of my board members, Irving Ladowski-Berger, was Sam Palmisano's #1 guy about innovation. And when I asked Irving, how did you take this big behemoth of a company and get it to be so nimble? He said, well, Sam said, we had to lower the center of gravity at IBM. Well, what did he mean by that? He meant that they had to push power out to the edge of the organization. They had to let regional managers have their budgets and do what they had to do to get their work done and stop having to report back to headquarters every time to get the lights turned on. And that's what made the difference. And so I think that's really what has to happen in America. My theory of what's going on in the world is that we live in a world in which the sources of leadership, innovation, and change will come from decentralized, networked, bottom-up forces. Why is this city the most exciting new place for people who are doing application development? It's because you've built the coolest network in the world. And that's a decentralized network. And you know, when we talk a little bit later about the smart grid, it applies to that too. And so the only question for America is not whether centralized, top-down, hierarchical forces are going to overcome decentralized, bottom-up network forces, but whether the global economic and cultural influence of the U.S. is going to grow or shrink. So what I'm hoping that through all this battle between libertarians and liberals, whatever, we can agree on some basic principles going forward, some common ground where we believe in freedom and equality, we believe in tranquility and trade, and we believe in this notion of federalism and regional experimentation. So America 1.0 worked really well for a long time because the notion of the public good was split between two forces. You had local forces building schools, roads, putting up firehouses and building local infrastructure. Then you had the federal government that could do the big heavy lifting, build the transcontinental railroad, build some of those dams for the TVA, or you know, build the interstate highway system. But those two things working together worked really well. In fact, from 1700 and especially starting in 1800, the income per capita in the United States, as you can see, grew faster than any place in the world. In other words, it worked, this regional distribution of power between local and central. And what it really did was to create regional pockets of innovation. And where Tom Edison put his little laboratory in Menlo Park, New Jersey, and drew into that laboratory scientists from Princeton and other places that were near it, that was a regional pocket of innovation, and it worked. Now, I believe that this change, a fatal change, began to happen in the 1890s when we decided that we wanted to go invade Cuba and take over the Philippines and do all sorts of things. And Mark Twain stood up and said, I'm an anti-imperialist. I'm opposed to having the eagle put his talents on any other land. And by 1917, when Woodrow Wilson said that we would basically make the world safe for democracy. In other words, we would become the world's unpaid policeman. A die was set that was really problematic for this country. And so from that point on, every year, whether we were fighting a huge enemy like the Soviet Union with many missiles and millions of dollars of defense infrastructure, or whether we were fighting a guy like Osama bin Laden holed up in his little house watching TV, hoping to inspire someone to get on, the military budget grew and grew and grew. And that became a problem, because if you look where our discretionary spending is today, the military takes 57% of the discretionary spending. And you look how little we spend on education, housing, veterans benefits, or health. That is where our budget priorities are, and I believe that has to change. Now, the biggest problem for us is the rest of the world is a free rider on our defense infrastructure. This is what we spend compared to what everybody else in the world spends. And basically, we are the unpaid cop to keep the Straits of Hormuz open, and the Chinese and the Japanese and everybody just free ride on all the money we spend for this. And that's just a fool's errand. So what really happened in the last few years that led to this problem that we had in 2008? Well, the biggest problem was that we had a revolution in productivity, and that revolution is partially created by the digital age that you are living off of in this day, and it was partially created by other problems or other ideas, which is the notion of outsourcing and robotics. And so while productivity continued to grow, and for many years up till 1980, productivity and real wages grew together. But in 1980, they began to split. Partially that was a huge growth in robotics and outsourcing, and partially it was the decision to cut income taxes on the really wealthy. So the revolution of robotics and outsourcing is not just a manufacturing revolution. You have the advantage of it when, I'm sure if you go to the Volkswagen plant here in Chattanooga, there's a lot of robots there. And that is the kind of productivity that we want to see. But one thing you don't really realize is that perhaps when you get your x-ray done at the hospital, that is outsourced to India to be read. Or when you have H&R Block do your taxes, that is outsourced to Ireland to be done. And so we have to be careful that we just don't outsource the rest of our world, because quite frankly, this has begun to devastate the middle class. For many, many years, median family income grew faster than the income of the highest 1/10%. But in 1980, that began to change. And in 1995 and into 2000, it really changed. And therefore, the middle class didn't grow, and the top 1/10% grew really fast. But the middle class didn't want to change their lifestyle, so what did they do? They borrowed against their home. They used their home as an ATM, and as you can see, their liabilities to their disposable income continue to grow, grow, and grow. And this obviously could not be sustained in the same way that the United States couldn't continue to borrow and borrow and borrow, whether it was government, whether it was people, whether it was companies. And just like that topped out at 303% in 1929, just before the crash, it topped out at 312% in 2008. And of course, we know what happened. Now, we have now recovered. We actually have a gross domestic product that is larger than we had before the crash. The only problem is we're so productive that we have 4 million fewer people producing that output. That is a problem that we're going to have to deal with. Now, The U.S. has some problems, but I'm going to argue to you that problems are nothing compared to what is going on in the rest of the world. And when everybody tells you that America is in decline, I'm going to argue that they're completely wrong. For one thing, we're a country that produces more food than any country in the world, and we can feed ourselves. And I will tell you that that is a unique thing. This is a chart that shows you what happens when food prices really rise. So when food prices rise, you get revolutions. I would argue that the Arab Spring had not so much to do with politics as it had to do with food being too expensive. And every time it rose again, you get more of these revolutions. The only problem is it's beginning to rise again. You all know we went through a horrible drought in this country, but we went through a drought in many, many other countries. And why is this happening? Well, this is happening because, despite what everyone would have you believe, global warming is actually changing things. I have a friend that we were with this weekend that said the champagne growers in France, the ground is so cracked that they can't grow champagne, and they're growing it in England. And they're sneaking it back into France so they can still call it champagne. Now that's just one example of the problem. The second problem is, of course, that in the developing world, population is still exploding. And so as more and more people enter into the lower middle class, they want protein to eat, they want all sorts of things, and that means they need more food. And this is something that becomes very, very problematic. And although the industrialized countries have got their population explosion in control, it is not in control in most of the rest of the world. And needless to say, the drought and ecological problems are creating water crises all over the world. This is the Aral Sea in the middle of the Soviet Union. As you see, there used to be ships there. That's the Somalian desert. And the regions that are in red are just plain out of water. The regions that are in yellow have not the right quality water. And so, as you can see, we're doing okay in this score. The second problem, of course, is the notion of ethnic tensions. Everywhere in the Mideast, there are Sunnis and Shia fighting with each other, and the notion that we can have anything to do with this or change this is just a fool's errand. This will go on, and it's not something that we have the ability to influence. And when there are droughts, when there are tensions, ethnic tensions, people tend to migrate. They want to leave the places where there's no food or leave the places where there's a lot of fighting and go to the places where they might have jobs. And as you can see, one of the places they tend to go to is Europe. This is going to create a whole new set of tensions in Europe because, needless to say, as the rising Muslim populations fill up the European cities, you're going to have incredible right-wing pushback from people like the English Defence League or Le Pen in France or in Netherlands. So a rise even in Germany of neo-Nazi parties. China. Everyone says to me, oh, China's the future. China is not the future. China has so many problems that the New York Times reported that in 2010, there were 127,000 what they called mass incidents. That's like when 2,000 people surround a police car and turn it over. As you see, for instance, Apple's supply chain has been interrupted 5 times in the last 6 months because there have been riots at the Foxconn plants because people aren't paid right or people's housing isn't there or anything like this. And the notion, obviously, that the Chinese are going to shut up the dissidents like Ai Weiwei or all these other people is nonsense. Aon, which is a big insurance company, puts out this map, and this is their map of the political risk. In the red countries, they suggest You don't go there, you don't send your employees there, you do nothing there. In the orange countries, you should not invest there, you should not put any major presence there, and in the yellow countries, you have significant high risk of investment. That leads a couple of islands in the world that are not problematic, one of them being the United States. Now, Merrill Lynch says that we are living in what they call a G0 world, a world where it's every nation for itself. And this world is going to look much more like the era of Metternich, the balance of power world, than anything you've seen before. The US will not be a hegemon, the Chinese will not be a hegemon, and will be a very balanced power world. But, as I said at the outset, the power will be through decentralized, network, bottom-up forces. And anyone who thinks that's wrong only needs to look at the European Union, which is trying to go in the exact opposite direction. It's trying to take power away from the regions and centralize it all in Brussels, and we see how that's working out. Or you should look at the fact that the Chinese are trying to control 600 million microbloggers with a censorship regime. That will not work. So what I'm going to suggest, and this brings me to what I think can happen here, is a notion which I call the new federalism. It is an idea that regional power and states should have more power, more taxing power, states and cities, and the federal government should have less power. Now, in 1905, there was a similar revolution attempting to do this, and this is when Teddy Roosevelt took on the big oil companies and the big banks, and here he is wrestling with John D. Rockefeller and J.P. Morgan. And as Richard Hofstadter said, the reform movement was there to restore a type of economic individualism and political democracy that was widely believed to have existed earlier in America and to have been destroyed by the great corporation and the corrupt political machine. The role of experimentation, to me, is absolutely critical. I've seen it. I was a judge at the gig tank. And Justice Brandeis said it is one of the happy incidents of the federal system that a single courageous state may, if its citizens choose, serve as a laboratory and try novel social and economic experiments without risk to the rest of the country. I believe that Chattanooga is one of those laboratories. What I'd like you to imagine is that America 3.0 would be a way in which we could have energy independence, where we could reduce our carbon footprint, where we could have a highly educated public, where we could have some fiscal sanity, and where we could reduce unemployment. So how would we get there? Well, the first thing I want to say is that we're already on the road. As you can see, our dependence on foreign oil is already declining. I saw a note that the U.S. might become the largest energy producer in the world in the next 10 years. We basically could, even without just our own self, in the Western Hemisphere, between what's in Canada, what's in Venezuela, what's in Mexico, and this is a little old, so the Brazilians have just discovered a whole lot of oil too. We could be totally energy independent tomorrow. We could tell the Arabs to pound sand, as far as I'm concerned, and we don't have to get any oil from the rest of the world, and we do not have to be spending our lives, of our bodies, our blood and treasure in hanging in the Middle East. But what we could really do to make this accelerate is get much more efficient. We could have more efficient cars, we could have plug-in hybrids, more efficient trucks, car and truck retrofits, better public transportation, clean and alternative fuels, more efficient air travel and new drilling production. All of this could save us by 2025 another 8 million barrels a day. We need to really seriously think about harnessing nature. There's no reason why solar power, there was 4 days last summer where Germany ran 50% of its electric grid on solar power. Germany. You've all been in Germany. It's pretty cloudy a lot of the time. And the point is, if Germany can do it, there's no reason we can't do it. Plug-in hybrids. Look at the comparison between what a plug-in hybrid gets in terms of miles per gallon, 93 miles per gallon, to your standard Toyota Corolla 30. If the roads were filled with that, our dependence on oil would drop radically. The smart grid. So you have taken the lead in building a smart grid. It is extraordinary, and I've said to Jim Ingraham, and I'll say to Harold as well, that you need to show the rest of the nation how to do this. Because quite frankly, 2 days ago, Governor Cuomo said he was going to get $30 billion to repair and create a smart grid in New York. Now, they don't know how to do this. You do. And if this town doesn't become the center of smart grid technology, you're just making a big mistake. And so because you've already done it, you know how to do it, you know what the systems are, you've built the platform and everything, this can be a town in which all the vendors who provide these technologies are going to want to be here, to be around here, because this is where the expertise is. And I promise you, in the same way that post 9/11, there was a huge opportunity to do all sorts of security stuff, there will be a huge opportunity to teach towns and cities across the whole East Coast how to build a smart grid. And there will be lots of shysters out there saying they know how to do it, and you guys actually have done it and deploy it, and you ought to be at the head of the line, and you ought to be you should be that place. Because quite frankly, the whole problem in Hurricane Sandy was electricity. Because the electricity went down, the cell phone towers didn't work, nothing worked, the hospitals had to close. That was the problem. And once you fix that situation, you guys know how to do it, that's a big deal. Water transportation. My wife and I were stuck in Atlanta trying to get to Chattanooga for about 2.5, 3 hours yesterday. If you had a high-speed train between Atlanta and Louisville, you could get to Chattanooga in 40 minutes, city center to city center. We're going to go on the fast train from Paris to Nice next, in a couple of days. It takes 3 hours to go from Paris to Nice, which is, So all of this obviously would radically reduce our carbon footprint. As you can see, the United States and Australia are the outliers in terms of carbon in the world. And if we had lots of hybrid, lots of electric high-speed trains, lots of smart grids, we would have a lot cleaner country. So let's talk about schools, because EPB and us and the Lyndhurst Foundation are doing a lot of things and thinking about how do you use this incredibly fast internet to bring learning to schools and connect schools up and make that happen. It's one of the sad things that the U.S. is 14th in reading, 26th in math, and 18th in science for 12th grade. That just shouldn't be. And if you want to have companies coming here, those companies are going to want really smart, educated students. They don't all have to be PhDs, but they have to be well educated. It is one of my desperate fears, and this is not a right or a left issue, that we have to really begin to think about school choice in innovative and experimental ways. Chris Jenks, who's not on the right, he's on the left, says that ghetto schools have become little more than custodial institutions for keeping children off the street. This is not the future we want for our kids, and we have to think about what we need to do. So the first thing I would suggest is we pay our teachers decently. In Korea, an average high school teacher gets 2.5 times the average income. In the United States, an average high school teacher gets 1.2 times the average income. A little more than you get to be a clerk in a department store. That doesn't make sense to me. We've been trying some fun experiments with distance learning. We did a duet between T-Bone Burnett and a singer here over 2,100 miles. Now, if that can happen over 2,100 miles, think about having a school orchestra between 5 high schools in Chattanooga, all playing together in sync because you have this incredible fiber optic technology. The other thing I would think about is, how do you make college affordable? I have students, and of course I'm at USC, so it's pretty expensive, but who are going to leave college with a debt of $125,000 starting their life. What kind of life is that, to be already $125,000 when you're 22 years old? That doesn't make sense. So in 1983, you could go to the University of Tennessee for $3,000 or $3,600. Today, in-state tuition is $22,000. Now, I'm not saying we have to get back to $3,000, but it ought to get somewhere between that for in-state tuition, and maybe you subsidize the courses that for the students you need in science, technology, math, something, make it cheaper for them. I don't really know exactly how you do it, but I certainly would like to see us do that. So I just want to finish by talking about a couple of things. All you're hearing right now is a fiscal cliff, fiscal cliff, fiscal cliff. This is a media construct made to make you scared and uncomfortable. We passed a sequester back in last summer that essentially was, for the first time in 70 years, going to cut the military budget by a serious amount of money. And we also know that the tax cuts for people making over $250,000 are going to expire. Now, it's not a fiscal cliff, because the day January 1 rolls around is not like the credit of full faith and credit of the United States is going to go away. It's not. So my situation and question is we've been yelling for years and years and years about we have to cut our deficit. If we chicken out on what we just did and let the tax cut, put the tax cuts back in and take out the sequester, the debt is going to skyrocket, that brown chart, right back, and everybody is to say, cut the debt, cut the debt. Well, if this goes through, the green chart is what's going to happen to the debt. It's, for the first time in a long time, going to go down. So I'm confused. What do we want? Do we want to begin to get fiscally sane or not? And so if my theory is, let January 1 come. Let us get rid of those tax cuts, and then maybe we obviously have got to give tax relief to the middle class, and we should build some jobs bills, help you guys deploy all sorts of new technologies, things like that. But this notion that we got to just back off when the first time we've made some real changes is, I think, wrong. Because quite frankly, it's time for us to reduce our military footprint. This is the 200 individual bases that we have around the world. You think we just got a few soldiers in Europe and Korea? No. And it's time for us to stop being the unpaid cop of the world. So Bill Gross, who runs the largest bond fund in the world, PIMCO, says what we need to do is build infrastructure. And I think that's really true. And that's how we're going to get this country back to the top dog. You know, in Tennessee, you have 5,000 bridges that are 50 years or older, because guess what? A lot of these bridges were built during the Great Depression. And, you know, by 2030, you're going to have 11,000 bridges that are going to be 50 years or older. Maybe we ought to be fixing those before people go into the drink. You've got the greatest supercomputer in the world. You've got the greatest fiber optic network in the world. And you ought to be not only extending that, but you should be using that to make this a center of innovation unlike any in the world. Because quite frankly, between broadband technology, that is information technology, and energy technology, I don't know of another city that has more knowledge embedded in it right now. So you think about, how do we pay for this? How do we pay for this infrastructure improvements? And I would make one suggestion, and it doesn't come from me, it comes from a guy named Tom Friedman. And he suggested what he calls a freedom energy tax, which is $1 a gallon on gasoline and an equivalent amount on the carbon streaming out of coal plants and other things. And that would generate somewhere in the neighborhood of $340 billion a year in taxes. And instead of leaving them at the federal government, you just rebate them right back to the states. In California, that would give us another $31 billion a year to build the infrastructure. I don't know exactly what the equivalent in Tennessee would be, but it's a lot of money. Finally, I just want to end with saying that we've had a wonderful experiment between EPB and the University of Southern California. And we found that the ability of universities to interface with companies is pretty astonishing. I give you this map because this is the map of Silicon Valley, right? And in the center of Silicon Valley is 2 universities, University of California at Berkeley and Stanford University. And out of those 2 universities have come more startups, more venture capital, more innovation than any place in the world. And there is absolutely no reason that this place can't be a similar, maybe smaller, but at least regional center of innovation. And in the end, you could become the world's leader in both in energy technology and the smart grid, and in information technology and broadband infrastructure. So, thank you very much.
Jonathan, thank you so much for those remarks about our future. We really appreciate everything you've done in Chattanooga over the last several years, and we're glad you know us. It's really great for Chattanooga to know that you're out traveling the world talking about what we're doing here. And as a small token of our gratitude, I wanted you to know that we have made a contribution to our new County Science, Technology, Engineering, and Math High School in your name. To Mr. Taplin, his wife, thank you for being here. Thank you for being a part of our community. And thank you for that message. You know, there's so much going on in the world. I don't know, it makes my head hurt, the things that we all have to process and know about. And the thing that excites me about what he said today is that Chattanooga is just not down here at the end of a stream taking whatever flows our way. And I think in the past, I sometimes felt that way as a young man here. I think Chattanooga is at the center of so many things, and this spirit of innovation that we're celebrating today is the reason for that. We have water, we've got the gig, we've got computing power, we have all of those things, as he pointed out, and we should be so proud. But most of all, we have a spirit of brain power that made this community what it is, and that still continues, and our best days are ahead. So thank you so much for celebrating that with us today.